All right. Maybe. Oh, there we go. Just lagging. Okay, perfect. All right. So a couple things off the top. Um, you should be able to see everything here on module 2. I meant to have it set to be released a little bit earlier, but there was some have it set to be published. I'll make sure that those are kind of available well in advance moving forward. So we'll work through these kind of skeleton slides today. I'll add in stuff from the dot cam that won't be on there. You can kind of already see those practice problems are up for the week now. This outline, which is kind of sets up the learning objectives that we'll kind of cover. You don't have to focus too much on that, but we'll always post those up there. And some additional files we might play around with a little bit on Thursday's class. So what should you have turned in last night? Nobody knows. So everyone's getting zeros on it. Week 1, module 1 quiz, and week 2 or module 2's kind of reading, right? So those module readings will always be 1 week in advance of the material that we cover to kind of prime your brain. I get that they might not seem like they're the most effective. The questions might seem a little bit easier sometimes. Honestly, it's just a way for me to make class a little more effective, but also a good way for me to give you easy effort points to kind of help increase your grade a little bit, right? So I'm trying to do you a favor, right, in terms of those, all right? So we'll kind of have those module readings, those quizzes, always do at the end of every Monday, okay? All right. Other than that, so everyone that filled out that collaborative learning poll, later this afternoon, I'll post up the list that, I mean, everyone's first preference, I assigned them to that slot. It ended up working out that way, so it's not that big of a deal. But you'll see a list where it's sortable by name. You can find your name and what day, time, location your CL session is. They'll start this Thursday and Sunday. Now, just because I put the list up there, it's really just a way for me to like guarantee that if anyone ever had a grade appeal thing that like I guarantee a slot in one of these locations. In terms of which ones you can attend and which ones you earn extra credit for, you can attend any one, right? Any day, location, you can change week to week. That list doesn't matter. That's more of a list for me to make just sure I'm covering mine, the things that I guaranteed everyone a spot in one of them. And like I said, even if I was to like be strict about it, everyone got in their first preference, so that was good. But yeah, you can attend any daytime that works for you week to week, but you will see that list pop up there later this afternoon, okay? Other than that, the next module reading, next quiz will pop up after Thursday's class, just kind of like last week. And that should cover what I usually kind of call the housekeeping stuff. Once we get later on to the class period, you guys are my second section. You're also bigger, so I can test things out with the first. Top had didn't work. So get Canvas pulled open. Later on in the class, I'm going to deploy. You can't see this quiz yet, but it's basically our weekly participation quiz. It might take a little bit of time initially, but once I open it up, I'll give you guys like 10 minutes to kind of work on it. You should be able to get in on the Wi-Fi well in advance of that 10 minutes. You'll also be able to see the problems up here. So even if you're waiting, you kind of get working a little bit ahead of time on those problems anyways. And we'll kind of see how that's going to work moving forward. Looks like we're going to have to use Canvas for those weekly quizzes. Okay. So I'll probably edit even the syllabus just to like pivot from not using Top Hat for those in-class quizzes, but using Canvas. Okay. All right. Any questions for me before we dive into material here today? I want to make sure I'm using this one. We're good? All right. And I'll talk more about those CL sessions, how you sign in, get recorded a little bit more on Thursday's class. Okay. And hopefully PowerPoint responds to me. I don't know, had a new version or something I had to upload earlier. So okay, looks like it's working. So this chapter module is probably the most macroeconomic we're going to get the whole semester, but it also has a lot of microeconomic applications. So we're going to kind of start out here. I'll try to start out very slow. If you have any questions at any point in time, stop me. Everything we do in this class just continues to build. So if you get behind early, it's going to have a snowball effect. right? So we're going to use some simplifying assumptions, which is we're going to look at like the world, but we're going to assume that we have one economy first, just one country. It's easier to think about that way. They have one resource that they use to produce things. We know that obviously it takes more than just labor to produce something, but we're going to simplify it so we can just look at one resource. We'll say labor, and they're producing only two goods. Here, I think I did what? Computers and produce, or, think about this as we can produce agricultural products or technology products as an economy. Okay? So this is our like simple, two good, one resource kind of model. Let's say we've got 50,000 total labor hours that we can put towards the production of both of these goods. If one computer is going to cost me 100 of these labor hours, and 10 of these labor hours would get me 1 ton of wheat, right? I can then start to think about, if I'm using all of these 50,000 labor hours to produce computers, how many total could I get? If I've got 50,000 labor hours, each computer costs me 100, how would I find out how many total computers I could produce? Oh, Jesus. If I have 50,000 labor hours, each computer is 100, I would take 50,000 and divide it by 100, right? That should give me 500 total computers, right? Now, that's when I'm putting all of my labor hours towards computer production. I'm not getting any tons of wheat. Okay? Now, I can find some points in between, but right now we'll think about the other extreme point. If I put all 50,000 labor hours towards wheat production, and each ton of wheat costs me 10 labor hours, how many total tons of wheat can I get? 50,000 divided by 10, right? So if I'm using all of my resources now, instead of producing computers, produce wheat, take that total number of labor hours, divide it by how many labor hours it takes to get 1 ton of wheat. That would tell me how many total, right? So I would get what? 50,000 over 10 is 5,000. So I can come up with these two extreme points, right? If I'm only producing wheat or only producing computers. Now, the points in between here, I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. For now, just know they exist, right? I don't have to just produce one good. I can produce combinations of the two, right? I can take half my labor hours, put it towards wheat production, half towards computer production. But once I have these extreme points, it's probably going to be just easier for us, really, and a lot of what we're going to do, to just work with those 2 points. So let's think about here. If I were to graph this out, I think this is how I have it. Well, it doesn't really matter. So let's do, I'll make it easier for us later on. Let's do computers on the x-axis. And let's do wheat on the y-axis here, okay? If I'm only producing wheat, we say we could produce 0 computers, but we would get 5,000 tons of wheat. And if we were only producing computers, 0 tons of wheat, but we're getting 500 total computers, okay? So we could draw a line in between these 2 extreme points where we're only using resources to produce one good, and this would represent all other combinations we could produce of these 2 goods using all of our resources. So there, I think I gave you 3 points in the slides, but theoretically, there's a ton of different points that I could find. Right? So this is what we'll call our production possibilities curve, or sometimes you'll see it referenced as the production possibilities frontier. Those 2 terms are interchangeable. They mean the same thing. I'll try to usually use PPC, but you might see me accidentally slip into saying PPF sometimes because both terms are used. It's not my phone. All right. So here would be kind of a graphical representation of those 2 extreme points. So we could think about, why was that other point, which I believe was 4,100 on my curve? Right? Well, let's think about the thought experiment. If we start out here, where we're only producing wheat, if I want to produce 100 computers, right? Well, how much? So if we think about what would the total kind of cost in terms of my labor hours of 100 computers be? Right? Well, if each computer was costing me 100 labor hours, that was what the information we're given, if I want 100 computers, what's the total number of labor hours I have to give up? 100 times 100, right? So here I've got what? I had to give up 1,000 labor hours. So if I'm now taking 1,000 labor hours in order to produce 100 computers, what am I not using these labor hours for? Producing wheat. So I can no longer produce 5,000 tons, right? That was if I was using all of my labor hours towards that. Yeah. Where do I want here? Oh, hold on. Oh, this is why. Sorry. I skipped a step. You're right. 10,000. So 10,000 labor hours. Thank you. So 10,000 labor hours is what it's going to cost me, right? How many tons of wheat would that be? Well, each ton of wheat was costing me what? 10 labor hours. So how many tons of wheat am I going to have to give up? That would be 1,000, right? So how many total labor hours was I giving up? 10,000. Each ton of wheat cost me 10 labor hours to produce. So I really had to give up 1,000. So I can no longer produce all 5,000 tons or bushels of wheat. I can only produce 1,000 fewer, or 4,000, right? So this point of 100 computers, 4,000 tons of wheat will be another point on my production possibilities curve where I'm using all of my labor hours. It's just now I'm not producing just one type of good. I'm producing a combination of the two. And we could go through a similar thought experiment and find those other points as well. And we'll hammer this a little bit more next class, actually thinking about how we find these different points. But this is kind of what's going on behind the scenes. As I produce more of one good, that's going to cost me some of my labor hours, which means I'm going to have to take those labor hours away from the production of the other good in order to get more of this x-axis good. I have to give up the production of this y-axis good. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Yeah. So if I want 100 computers and each computer costs me 100 labor hours, what's that total cost of labor hours? 100 times 100. Yep. And you generally won't have to go through this every single time. Like I said, we'll focus on this a little bit more next class. But really, once we start to talk about costs, we can kind of skip this step. So we'll hold off on this. Like I said, probably get there more next class. But we'll understand how we can come up with the actual cost of one good here in just a second. Okay? Any other questions on this before we keep? Okay. So I left a slide blank there. So usually that means, there we go. We did some work in class, right? So nothing will pop up. I'm not going to like upload new slides. This is why you should show up, right? There's going to be things we add into these slides that aren't going to show up on Canvas, okay? So the next thing that we're going to talk about is once we can identify those two extreme points and think about there's all these different combinations in between that we could also produce in our economy, we're going to talk about costs, right? So anytime we produce something, in our example, when I wanted more computers, what did I have to do? Give up wheat production, right? There's always going to be, we talked about last class, what? It starts with a T, 2 words. When I do something, excuse me, and not something else, that is a trade-off, right? Excuse me. Anytime I choose to do something, that means I'm giving up something else, which means that anytime I do something, there's also going to be an opportunity cost. Right? So my opportunity cost here, when I want to produce more of the x-axis good, I had to give up production of the y-axis good. Okay. So for us, what that's going to end up being, and I can kind of walk you through it here visually in a second. But anytime you want to know the cost of your x-axis good, the way that we drew this out, it's going to be the slope of that production possibilities curve. Okay? And we'll think a little bit harder about that in a second with some numbers. But for now, we'll say the slope of that production possibilities curve is the cost of one more of that x-axis good in terms of the y-axis good. So it's how much of the y-axis good we have to give up to get one more unit of the x-axis good. And then here, trade-offs make it a little annoying. We're talking about costs. So inherently, we know they're negative. Anytime I have a downward sloping line, I know the slope is going to be negative. When we talk about costs, we're going to ignore that negative sign essentially, right? We already know it's a cost. We just want to know what the value is. So that's why we have that negative slope up there is going to represent our cost. Essentially, if it's easier for you to think about, I don't know what everyone's math background is, we're taking the absolute value. We're just ignoring that negative sign, okay? So that slope is going to tell us the cost of the x-axis good. And what ends up being true, and I'll walk through an example to prove this to you here in a second and make it a little bit easier to think about. Well, the cost of our y-axis good ends up being 1 over that slope, okay? Once again, there's a negative sign because we're ignoring the negative, or we just want the absolute value. But the cost of that y-axis good in terms of the other good, the x-axis, is 1 over that slope. Okay? So we'll go back to our example. I've got it summarized here, but we actually had it drawn up here, so we might as well use this, right? So if I wanted to know the cost of one more computer, I said that it's going to represent the number of units of wheat we would have to give up. And I said that should just simply be the slope, right? So when you think about it this way, if I'm going from the extreme points, 5,000 and 0 to 0, 500, how would I calculate the slope of a line? It's the change in. Guys, you shouldn't be here if you don't know this. You calculate a slope by the change in. So someone started saying rise over run, or the change in. What is this axis? Y over the change in. You guys are scaring me early on. Maybe do some math review if that doesn't look familiar. Okay. So what's the change in my Y between these 2 points? I'm going from 5,000 to 0. So negative 5,000. What's the change in X? I'm going from 0 to 500. So the change in X is 500. So I end up with what? Negative 10 is my slope. Or what this represents is the cost of getting one more computer. What am I going to have to give up? 10 units of the other good, or in this case, 10 tons of wheat, whatever the units of that y-axis good is. Okay? So calculating the slope of these production possibilities curves will give me the cost of my x-axis good. And you can kind of think about why. If every computer cost me 100 labor hours and every ton of wheat cost me 10, how many tons of wheat then, if I gave up, would I have enough labor hours to produce a computer? Well, 10 of them, right? Now, you don't have to do this every single time, but it'll end up being the case, right? I think it's probably easier in all these models. You'll always be given enough information to simply use these 2 extreme points where you're only producing one of each type of good and find that slope. That tells you the cost of your x-axis good, okay? Everybody with me up to this point before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So what if I instead wanted the cost of one more unit of my y-axis good? So one thing I could do is, and I'll do this real quick because I wouldn't recommend this, but I could draw a whole new graph, right? Put the good I'm interested now, wheat, on my x-axis. 5,000 was the total if I was only producing wheat. 500 if I'm only producing computers. I now have a new slope. The slope should tell me the cost of my x-axis good. Change in y. I'm going through this quick because I wouldn't suggest always doing this. Would be 500, change in x, 5,000. And I end up with what? 1/10 of a computer is how much 1 ton of wheat would cost me. But this means I'm gonna have to like redraw this every single time. If I've already got this drawn out and I already know the cost of my x-axis good over here, what'll always be the case is the cost of my y-axis good will always be just 1 over the slope. Or 1 over the cost of whatever good is on our x-axis. So what was the slope or the cost of our x-axis good? 10. So the cost of wheat is going to be 1/10 of a computer, which notice it's the exact same thing if we had redrawn this entire model. So once you find the cost of your x-axis good, you always know the cost of your y-axis good is just 1 over that, right? Or what's another term for this? I might start using this a little bit. 1 over a number is the inverse, right? Or reciprocal. You could use that. I probably will say inverse, but reciprocal is a little more mathy, so that's good. Okay. Any questions over anything here before we keep moving? So given this information about using all my resources, I can produce this many of the x good, this many of the y, draw our production possibilities curve, calculate the slope that tells us the cost of the x-axis good. We can then also find the cost of the y-axis good by 1 over that. Okay. Other questions here before we keep on trucking. Okay. All right. We're good with that. So we'll switch back over here. So I've kind of got some of what we just talked about summarized, right? We kind of just worked through it in more detail. So this is where these are skeleton slides. Sometimes even if I don't have a blank slide up here, we're going to do some stuff in class. Right? So we also know that we can understand the costs of these countries. We'll think about this at a bit more of a micro level, and then we'll go back to countries and think about this. But we've got more than one country in the world, right? We have more than one person. So costs can vary. Just because we can calculate the cost of one more computer, maybe some countries can produce that at different, different costs. So we'll start out with this example where I've got the CEO of Ford, and if they wanted to fix their own car, we could do it in an hour. Okay. So I don't know. Somehow they have a background. They're really good at fixing cars. There's a mechanic, and it would cost them 3 hours, and they could charge $200 an hour. So why would the CEO not choose who can fix this car quicker? CEO, why are they likely to rely on the mechanic? If they fix the car themselves, they're going to have to give up an hour, but that hour is extremely valuable. Talked a little bit, I think, use this example last class, right? So we don't just care about who can do more of something or who can do something better necessarily, or who can do more of it. We'll talk about that in countries. Who can produce this faster? It's who can produce this at a lower cost. Yes, it might on its face look like, well, it's 1 hour. CEO has a lower cost. Well, no. That hour has a different value for the CEO than it does when you can. So we'll start to talk about things like absolute and comparative advantages. Just because I have an absolute advantage, I can fix the car quicker. That doesn't mean I can fix it at a lower cost. So absolute advantage would, in this example, mean I can fix the car quicker. Comparative advantage means I can produce it at a lower cost. See, CEO here, what would it cost them? $2,500. It's time's very valuable. Okay. So maybe a bit more of an example that we'll kind of see play out. We can do this at the individual level. I just like that to kind of set up the idea. We'll think about 2 countries. Okay. So an absolute advantage, back to our country models, just means if I'm using all of my resources, I can produce more of a certain good. Okay. So if I'm using all of my resources, I can produce more of a certain good than another country. So what do you think is true about the US in terms of the goods that it has an absolute advantage in producing? Well, we've got pretty good sized population. This might also apply to like China, pretty big populations. We also have not just a lot of labor hours, we have a lot of other resources, right? And so we probably have a lot of absolute advantages. Now, why do we not see the US, for example, really focus a lot on like textile or clothing production? Well, because that's taking resources, producing a good that they can't sell for as much money. They could our time period, and the mechanic could only fix one. Okay, just keep going. Well, the audio might be screwed up. This is why I said don't rely on these, because I don't know. Oh, it looks like it's recording. We'll see. If not, I'll post up the one from my other section. We covered the same material. So what do we care a little bit more about? Not absolute advantage, but who can produce at a lower cost. So whoever can produce at a lower cost, we would say this is they have a comparative advantage in that good, right? So in our example, that was that the mechanic likely has a comparative advantage because their time isn't as costly, right, to give up their time to fix this car. Now, what did we just talk about? A model, we can come up with cost by looking at what? Slope of production possibilities curves, right? So we can identify the cost of different countries and see who has both an absolute advantage in production of certain goods, but also more importantly, who has comparative advantages. So a comparative advantage is whoever produce something at the lowest cost. So if I can produce something at the lowest cost, it's likely we want to rely on that country to produce that good, right? They're the ones who can produce it the cheapest. Sounds like a good thing, right? So how do we do that, right? So let's set up this model where we've got two countries now, not just one, and we have the production of two goods. So I think here I chose iPhones and aircraft parts, right? So both countries can produce either of these goods. If they're putting all their resources towards the production, okay, there we go. I might sometimes give you that information like in a 2x2 matrix, right? So this is saying if the US uses all of its resources to produce iPhones, it can produce 60. If India uses all of its resources to produce iPhones, 50. These numbers obviously don't make, we're keeping them easy to make the math easy, right? Only aircraft parts 30, India, only aircraft parts 10, okay? So if I'm looking at this and I wanted to identify absolute advantages, who has an absolute advantage in iPhone production? The US, using all their resources, they can produce more. What about aircraft part production? It would be the US here. Right? So this is an example where one country has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. That can occur. Like I said, in fact, if we're looking at more developed countries, a lot of the times, if we're comparing them to less developed countries, they're going to have an absolute advantage in almost every good, right? With the exception of maybe certain countries have agricultural products that the US doesn't, or things like that. Right? So that's absolute advantages, but what we might care about more is who can produce these goods at a lower cost. So, right, we already talked about these questions. I know I've got it up here. We could draw out those two extreme points for both countries. I think here I put iPhones on the x-axis, and I'll draw it out separately. You could superimpose it on the same graph. And if you draw it to scale, I know these are drawn to scale because I put them into Microsoft Excel because I know that they're graphed correctly. But how could I tell who has a lower cost? Well, even if I don't have the numbers here, let's say I didn't give you any of the numbers on the X and Y axis. Who do you know has a lower cost to iPhone production? What represents the cost of the x-axis good? The slope. So based off the slope here, who do you know has a lower cost to that x-axis good? Why? It's smaller or flatter. Now, when you're drawing these out on your own, it's easy to not draw things out to scale. So I wouldn't want to rely on it. But if we have things drawn to scale, really whoever has a flatter production possibilities curve, that means they have a lower cost to producing that x-axis good. So here, who has a comparative advantage in iPhone production? India has the flatter production possibilities curve. Now we'll work through the numbers and actually prove this here in a second. So instead of putting them all on the same graph, let's say I did this, right? I'm going to put them on different graphs here. So we're going to do, did I have iPhones? I'm going to do this a little bit differently. I think this will just help with the numbers starting out. Well, yeah. So let's do it this way. Okay. So I'm going to just put them on separate graphs for right now. So we said the US, if they're producing only iPhones, I think it was 60, and then aircraft parts was 30. Okay. So here was their production possibilities curve. India, only iPhones was 50, And here I'll show you, maybe I was making a mistake. Maybe I put 10 out here. So let's say I didn't draw this to scale. I'm going to show you that it doesn't matter. I don't have to just rely on like looking at who has a flatter curve. If I have the numbers, I can always just do this numerically. Okay. So who's going to have a comparative advantage in aircraft part production, or who can produce it at a lower cost? Well, the US, what represents the cost of the x-axis good? The slope of our production possibilities curve. Right? So what's the slope of this production possibilities curve? What's my change in y between these 2 points? 60, or technically negative 60, divided by my change in x. So negative 2. We said we just want to know the absolute advantage. So really, each aircraft part is costing the US 2 iPhones. That's their cost. Now, what about India? Well, their cost to an aircraft part, once again, is going to be the slope. So here we're going from 50 to 0, so negative 50. 0 to 10 was the change in x. Here we get negative 5. We just care about the absolute value. So the cost for one aircraft part to India would be 5 iPhones. So if we're thinking about here, this is the cost of one aircraft part to both countries. So who has a lower cost? 5 lower than 2? No. So who has a lower cost? The US. So we would say that the US has a comparative advantage, right? I'll CA here, or comparative advantage in the production of aircraft parts. They can produce it at a lower cost. So everybody with me up to that point. Okay. Now, I can always, and so here it doesn't matter. If I had drawn the slopes and I accidentally drew India's, a little bit flatter, it doesn't matter. If I use the actual numbers, I can always tell who has a comparative advantage. Now, what about a comparative advantage in the other goods? So who has a comparative advantage in iPhone production? Right? Well, what's the cost of one more of the y-axis good to the US? Well, here we said, if I want the cost of the y-axis good, what do? 1 over the slope, or the inverse of whatever the cost of the x-axis good is. So 1 over the slope, 1 over the cost of the x-axis good, which here is going to be what? 1 over 2, or each iPhone is going to cost us 0.5 aircraft parts. Okay. What about for India? Same kind of thing. What would 1 over the slope be for them? 1 over 5, or 0.2 aircraft parts. So when it comes to iPhone production, who has the lower cost? So we would say that India has the comparative advantage in iPhone production, whereas the US, I kind of left it out here, but had the comparative advantage in aircraft part production. So when it comes to comparative advantages, it's always going to be the case that you can only have a comparative in these basic 2 good models, 2 country, 2 good models. You can only have a comparative advantage in the production of one of those goods. Okay? So anytime you're asked a comparative advantage question, you should have you can't have, unlike the absolute advantage, you can't have the same country have a comparative advantage in the production of both goods. It has to be one or the other. Okay? Now, why is that the case? Well, think about it this way. If I have X is less than Y, or that was what? 2 is less than 5 here. Right? This was when we were finding like the cost of the x-axis good, or aircraft parts. If I want the cost of my y-axis, what did I do to these numbers? 1 over. Anytime I take the inverse, so 1 over x and 1 over y, what would happen to this sign? has to flip because I'm now dividing by a number over here. The denominator is larger. I can prove this to myself with numbers. Oh, sure enough, 1/2 is greater than 1/5. And I could choose any set of numbers, right? As long as x is less than y, 1 over x will always be greater than 1 over y. So that's why I can only have a lower cost in the production of one of these goods. I'm not going to make you reproduce this part. Sometimes I tell you things, I just like to give you like the reasoning behind why, even if it's not going to necessarily show up on like a quiz question. Okay? But that's why you can only have a comparative advantage in one good, because the way we calculate these costs, the cost of your y-axis good is the inverse, or 1 over the cost of the x-axis good. Okay. Any questions over anything here? No, I'm throwing a lot at you. We're okay with this? Sure. Now's the time to ask questions. Okay. So there you go. We already kind of walked through this. You could do it the reverse as well. Like in the ones that I drew for you, I put aircraft parts on the x-axis just because I knew that the numbers were nicer when we calculated the slopes. 2 and 5 as opposed to 0.2 or 0.5. But you could do it. It doesn't matter which good you put in the x-axis. You can just solve it the same way, right? You're just solving it in a different order, right? You'd be solving it for the x-axis good, iPhones first instead of aircraft parts. So we already talked about comparative advantages. We said they can vary, and we calculated all of them right here. So we've got absolute advantages. We've got comparative advantages we can identify. We're then going to kind of moving kind of quick for you guys. So that's good, though. It'll save us time for gains of trade. Let's do here. I'm going to publish this. Let me make sure it'll show up to you guys. I think it will. Yeah, it should show up now. So now on the home page or under quizzes, I guess, we'll go down here. That class participation 1 over 21, right? To today's date. So generally, like I said, I'll try to remind you, especially early on, open Canvas up at the beginning of class so you have that tab ready to go. Excuse me. I'll probably preview this for you so you can see the questions up here as well. Today will be a little bit different. I'll kind of walk through these with you just so we can kind of get used to getting logged in. So how many people gotten the quiz to pull up already? Actually, let me say it this way. How many people have not? Okay, so let's give it a minute or two. Make sure you kind of get that quiz. Try to get it pulled open. It should, like I said, based off the last section, we should be able to get everybody here in a minute or two. So once you have that quiz pulled open, right, I would probably, generally be like, okay, let's take the next 10 minutes or so and talk to the people around you, work on this set of questions. Now, usually it'll look a little bit different. I'll kind of have like a question where it's like, click yes to earn the 2 base points for the quiz or whatever it is, right? Here, don't worry about the points thing. I'm going to do some manipulation after class. So I just wanted to kind of have a template, a sample quiz with some questions to go for today. Usually there'll be a question that's just like click it and you get the participation. And then the remaining questions, you get points for getting it correct. Right? Now, today we're going to walk through everything together. So everyone should get it correct. So that's why I didn't do that. Right? So if I'm looking at a model like this, and this is where having it pulled open in front of you might make it a little bit easier to see the image. But I've got kind of this age-old example in economics, which is economies or countries can produce 2 things. Things that defend themselves or feed their people. So we've got guns and butter, right? Agricultural products or military products. So if I'm looking at this, how many guns using all of my resources? So I didn't give you that nice 2x2 matrix here. I just gave you the graph. How many guns, if I'm using all of my resources, could this economy produce? Yeah, 600, right? What did you do? I just went to the point where they're producing 0 tons or whatever unit of butter and only producing guns. That should be an easy question. So sometimes the questions in class might be this easy. I might use them as a barometer to see like, how many people am I losing at the most basic level of this concept, right? Okay. All right, so we're 2 minutes in. How many are still not able to have this pulled open? A handful. What's it giving you? Just taking time. Try refreshing it, right? And going back and clicking on, like I said, I got everybody in the last section in about 3 or 4 minutes. Yeah. Say that again. So this is where we're walking through these together today. So we'll talk about that here in a second. We haven't gotten to question 2 yet, right? I want to make sure we can get everyone to kind of open that quiz once we kind of get through all these questions, okay? So have it keep going. Hopefully, like I said, we'll get everybody in here before we end today. This should be, I think, just give it a little bit of time, okay? All right, question 2. So the next one would be something like this. So let's say I've got the opportunity cost. I wanted to know of producing 1 more unit of butter. So a ton of butter, whatever this is. How would I calculate? First of all, what axis is the good I'm wanting to find the cost on? X-axis. So what should represent the cost? Slope, right? How can I find the slope? Well, technically, I could use any 2 points on this graph. What are probably the easiest 2 points to use? The intercepts. Right, the 2 extreme points. I'm only producing guns or only producing butter. So what would my change in Y be? 600 to 0, so 600 or negative 600. Change in X, we're going 0 to 800. So 600 over 800 should be what? 3/4 or 0.75. So here you're entering this in, right? 0.75 as a numerical response would be the correct answer. Now, usually I would probably set this one up. An additional concept if I wanted to test would be to set up as a multiple choice. Here, I'm just caring about the value, right? It's 0.75. But we do want to make sure it's 0.75 what? That would be the next concept I might ask you a question on or might incorporate. When I'm producing more butter, I'm giving up 0.75 what here? Guns, right? The other good. Now here, this one's just numerical, so just 0.75 is all you need to enter in. But if it's a multiple choice questions, maybe I have 0.75 guns, 0.75 butter, you know, what I try to confuse you a little bit. It's always in terms of the other good, right? So that slope will be the cost of our x-axis good in terms of the other good, okay? Any questions on that one? Okay. We still have any issues with the quizzes out there? Anybody not in? I'm going to say it again. Anybody not get the quiz to open up? See? I thought we did it. So it might take a couple minutes, which is why I would open it up. I'll always try to display them up here. I might even talk through them with you. So even if you're waiting for the quiz to pull open on your device, you can kind of start working on them early. You know, talk to the people around you. I'll try to get more than enough time to where like it's adequate amount of time to work on it and to kind of get into that quiz. Right. But like I said, just if it's not uploading, I'll walk through the questions, kind of display them up here as well. Hopefully it gets a little bit less clunky as we move forward. I might send some emails to see if I can put some pressure to do things, although I know that, never mind. That's my own gripe. But I know there's things they could do to increase the Wi-Fi capability in this classroom that they aren't doing. So maybe I can put some pressure on them a little bit. But I think that, like I said, should give more than enough time to make sure everyone's getting in when we use these in class. Sometimes I'll use them like today. We've still got, what, 30 minutes left? Right, so I'll use them in the middle of class. Sometimes I'll use them at the end. Sometimes I'll use them at the beginning, maybe to do some review. If I think there's some things that I saw pop up like on a quiz, then I'm like, man, everybody got this wrong. We might want to talk about this before we move on this week, okay? Any questions on those 2 before we keep moving here? So I put this 3rd one in here because I was ambitious. And I don't think we'll quite get there today. So what I'm going to do with this quiz, like I said, I thought maybe we could use Top Hat in the first section. Let me know that's not possible at all. We waited a good amount of time. No one got it. I still had like 50 people not in there. So we'll kind of use these in-class quizzes. I'll probably update the syllabus as well to kind of indicate we will be using Canvas. It looks like the only way we're going to be able to do it using the Wi-Fi capabilities in this building. I would, for this one, just make sure you got those first 2 answers in. I'm going to go in and just give everybody credit for that 3rd one. We haven't talked about it. But basically, if you were here today and you responded, you're going to get questions or you're going to get credit, the full kind of credit for participation. Moving forward, like I said, I'll have a question at the beginning, which is just like click here for the base point. And then each question is worth this many additional points. Usually there will be about 2 questions, each one being worth half a point, because the total, like, each in-class quiz is worth 2 points, the way that it kind of works out. So you'll get the 1 base point just for being here responding, the other 2 kind of from correctly answering those 2 questions. So usually 2 questions a day. I might throw in a third one sometimes worth 0 points, because once we close these out, you can always go back and review them. So I might throw in some additional questions, even if we don't use them for points in class, just so you have additional things to like go back through. Right? Which this might end up being one of them. We won't have talked about today, but after Thursday's class, you might go back. This is, oh, I now know how to answer this question. Right? So I just another way of me trying to get out more types of questions. The best way to learn in this class is just by doing. Right? All right. Any questions for me before we jump back into slides? Get out of this quiz here. Okay. So make sure you click submit. Right. I think I have this set to be due at 10:30. So I try to guess about when I'm going to use them in class. Have the due date set so that make sure you're here, getting it done, getting it submitted. I might have a little bit less buffer time moving forward, kind of manually update before we start the quiz when that time will actually be. So I start it before I start it and make it available to all of you. I might set the due date to be like 10 minutes from when I start, or 15 minutes or whatever it is. Okay. All right. We're good with that? Okay. All right. So good way for me to incentivize you to show up to class, because I know, once again, well, I'm dealing with some issues from last semester. I know that if you stop attending class, it's not going to be great for your grade, right? You're going to lose points from these, but just in terms of you cannot fall behind. You fall behind a week in this class, it's like, because everything builds, that next week you're already going to be, you know, moving in with a broken leg or whatever the analogy is, right? So make sure we're doing our best to kind of get here on time. I might use it at the beginning of class, which might have been an issue for some of you today. I get that it's cold, so today might have been exceptional. I don't know what buses are doing, and maybe your car wouldn't start this morning. I've been there. All right, that's enough of me talking. So let's go back the slides here, and we've got one more thing to go through today before we get out of here. Oh, there we go. Which is, once we can identify costs of these countries, okay, the next thing we want to think about is, how could maybe trade make both of these countries better off? Okay. So I'm going to use the same numbers, so we don't have to start from scratch here. But we've got iPhones, aircraft, part production. We already talked about the costs for both of these. We identified those already. So let's think about this thought experiment. And sorry, just as a reminder, did I have this phrase? So iPhone, yeah. So the cost of an aircraft part to the US, just to remind you, was 2 iPhones. And the cost to India was 5. Right? So how many iPhones would India be willing to trade with the US to get one more aircraft part? Well, if they do it themselves, how many iPhones did they have to give up? If they produce an aircraft part, I just said the cost to India was 5. So as long as the US asks for anything less than 5, I'm better off trading with the US than making it myself. So for India, in terms of trade, in terms of how much is an aircraft part going to be traded for, anything less than 5, I'm better off trading than producing it myself. Is that making sense? Shouldn't be too crazy. What about for the US? If they're giving away an aircraft part, well, if they stop producing an aircraft part, how many iPhones could they then produce? 2. So as long as they trade an aircraft part away and then get more than 2, they're better off trading than just producing those iPhones themselves, right? So what does that really give us, right? That the terms of trade for a good is anywhere in between the cost of the 2 countries or 2 people involved. So here are 2 costs, were 2 and 5. I'm going to write this out in a slightly different way. That's more generalized, okay? So here I had the cost of and I think we had aircraft parts originally on the x-axis. So the cost of like my x-axis good, or I don't want this, sorry. I'm talking and writing. We're not talking about costs. We wanted the terms of trade for our x-axis good, which for us, that was kind of aircraft parts. Now, we just said it's going to be anywhere in between 2 iPhones and 5 iPhones. Makes sense for both individuals, right? Both countries could be better off. And we'll show why here in a second. But really, in general, what that's going to mean is the terms of trade for a good, if that's our x-axis good, or even really the y-axis, it's just going to be above the lowest cost country's cost. It's kind of weird, but like whatever country has the lowest cost above what their actual cost is, right? So we have 2 countries, whoever has the lowest cost. So I'm calling it the lowest cost country's cost, right? And then as long as it's below the highest cost country's cost, right? Which, who had the lowest cost in our example? The US with 2 iPhones. Who had the highest cost and what was their cost? That would be India with the 5 iPhones, right? So this was the US's cost. They had the lowest cost. This was India's cost. They had the highest. Okay. This is kind of like our general, and this was like our specific example. Now, what I could also do here, what if I wanted my, and this is my terms of trade for one more aircraft part. What would the terms of trade be for one more iPhone? Well, it's going to be in between the costs of the 2 countries. But even if I can't remember, what's the cost of one more iPhone to the US here? So their cost to an aircraft part was 2 iPhones. To India, it was 5. Right? What would the cost of one more iPhone be to the US? If I know the cost of the x-axis good, cost of the other good would be 1 over that, right? So this would be what? 0.5 aircraft parts. So to get one more iPhone, I'm giving up half an aircraft part. And we said for India, that would be 1/5 or 0.2. So the terms of trade for one iPhone is going to be above whatever country had the lowest cost. Now that's India. Their cost was 0.2 aircraft parts. And below the US's cost, which was, they had the highest cost, which was 0.5 aircraft. Now you'll kind of notice you could do the same thing here. Problem is it gets kind of confusing because like if I do the inverse, 1/2 and 1/5, well, because I did the inverse, these would flip and we're now not writing it in the way we typically do, but it's saying the same thing. So you could do it this way if that makes sense to you. But to me, it makes sense a little bit more. Like always think about having this general form and then calculating the cost. The terms of trade will be, is it above the lowest cost country's cost, below the highest cost country's cost? Questions on this? Am I saying something? I'm sure that's grammatic. There's probably an easier way to say that. I guess it's above the cost of the country that has the highest cost. I'm just trying to be economical with my words. Okay. Nope, that was not supposed to be a pun either, Econ, but I'm just trying to use as few words as possible. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. Okay. So now let's think about, we can come up with these terms of trade. And we went through this one as well. That would work for both countries. I think the intuition there, it makes sense why these countries would want to agree to any value in this range, right? So just to kind of, I think this one's a little bit easier because it's like whole numbers. For here, it makes sense. The US is okay trading away, is willing to trade away an aircraft part as long as they get anything more than 2 items. Because if they did it themselves, they're only going to get 2. So they'd be better off. India is more than willing to give anything less than 5 iPhones to get 1 aircraft part, because if they made it themselves, it cost them 5. Right? So let's think about where they would be at before they trade. So this is where I said next class will take a little bit more time instead of just thinking about the extremes, to think about the points in the middle. But for now, just trust me that 2 of the points on the production possibilities curves of these 2 countries would be 15 iPhones, 22.5 aircraft parts for the US, 25 iPhones, 5 aircraft parts for India. Right? So before trade, we were at what? A total of 40 iPhones, 27.5 aircraft parts for the entire world. 2 countries, obviously, we're simplifying it here, but the same principles would apply if we just added more countries in. Right? So we start out here, nobody's trading. Let's instead assume, right, that instead of this before trade scenario, we just have both countries only produce what they have a comparative advantage in. And then we allow them to trade. And let's say they come to some agreement in that range of terms of trade. So anywhere between 2 and 5, we'll say they agree that every aircraft part is worth 3 iPhones. Okay. All right. So let's go with this thought experiment. If the US is only producing what they have, well, how do I want to set this up? Yeah, this should work. No, it's not. I didn't give myself enough room. We're going to have the same thing, but I need to make sure I give myself more room. So we got the US aircraft part. We'll put iPhones way over here. And then India aircraft part, iPhones over here. Okay. So initially, we go back and remember who had the lower cost to an aircraft part. The US only had to give up 2 iPhones. India had to give up 5. So who has the comparative advantage in aircraft part production? The US can do it at a lower cost. So they're only going to produce aircraft parts. And if they were only producing aircraft parts and we go back, we said they could produce 30. If India was only producing iPhones and we go back to that original table, we said they could produce, I think it was 50, if I remember correct. So each country here is producing what they have a comparative advantage in, or the lowest cost. Remember, India, their cost to an iPhone was what? 0.2 of an aircraft part. The US's was 0.5. So India has a lower cost to the iPhone production. If we've agreed that each aircraft part is going to be traded for 3 iPhones, let's say, I'm going to make sure I get these numbers to match the slides. We could choose another set, but this will make more sense. So let's say let's say India wants 5 aircraft parts, right? So the US is going to give up 5 aircraft parts to India, right? In return, how many iPhones is India going to give the US? Well, if each aircraft part, thank you. Sorry. Sometimes this thing is sensitive. Why are you not switching over? There it goes. So if each aircraft part we agree is worth 3 iPhones, and the US is going to give 5 aircraft parts, it's producing all of its resources to produce only aircraft parts. It's going to give 5 to India. So India is now going to have 5 aircraft parts. How many iPhones is India going to have to give the US? Well, if each aircraft part is worth 3 iPhones, the total would be 15, right? So the US is going to get 15 iPhones. India is going to have to give up 15 iPhones. So our after trade values would be what? 25 and 15, 5 and 45. So what am I looking at? Oh, yep, you're right. Sorry. Thank you. 35, right? So how many total iPhones are we getting in like the entire world? 50. How many total aircraft parts are we getting? From the 30. Well, we can think about this comparing it to where we were at before. So before trade, total number of iPhones we had would have been 40 instead of 50. Total number of aircraft parts, we only had 27 and a half instead of 30. So each country here is better off, right? Because our numbers with trade, so these are the numbers that we just produced, right? The US is going to have the same number of iPhones, but more aircraft parts if they rely on trade as opposed to just doing it themselves. And India is going to end up with more iPhones, but the same number of aircraft parts if they rely on trade as opposed to just doing it themselves. So would it be self-rational or self-rational? Would it be rational and self-interested for these countries to trade? Yeah, they're both going to be better off, right? So as long as we can come up with the terms of trade that's somewhere in between our two costs, you could do this thought experiment with, instead of 3 iPhones being the agreed upon number, 4, or 3.5, or 2.75. Any number in that range that we came up with for terms of trade will result in an after trade outcome where both individuals could be better off. Or think about it this way, not only are both individuals better off, in this case, in this specific scenario, both countries being better off actually ends up with the entire world having more also being better off, right? We said instead of 40 iPhones, 27 and a half aircraft parts, we now have 50 iPhones, 30 aircraft parts. Why? If we rely on trade, what is each person doing? They're producing what they're the best at producing. Now, when we say the best, they're producing what they can produce at the lowest cost. We're using as few resources as possible to get that same number of goods, right? Now, in practice, trade does not just exist coming up with a number that works for both of us. There's, defense issues. There's things that exist other than economics, right, that might impede trade. But when we're talking about from a purely economical standpoint, trade is always going to benefit both parties, right? It's always going to make both individuals better off, and also the entire kind of society. Or if you think about, you allow your individuals to trade within your own economy, it's going to make your economy better, right? So we did this at like a country level. You can do this, a very similar thing, and do this at like a very micro level. So if I'm a firm, who do I want working, in certain sectors of my organization? Whoever is the most efficient or effective in that sector, right? Whoever is, their labor hours, it's not costly for them not to be doing other things. I don't have like my best salesmen, working in, packing boxes, right? Or whatever, they're doing whatever they have the best skill at or the lowest cost to not doing other things within my company. So we'll look at it really just for the sake of us and the examples I use, primarily like a more macroeconomic level, but you can break this down to a microeconomic and think about firm decisions as well, right? And it's not just 2 countries. Now I've got 2 workers, right? Okay. The trade stuff doesn't make as much sense when you think about workers, unless you've got like some weird policies about workers trading their what they do for the company. But here we'll kind of keep it at the country level. Okay. So you don't like trade, right? A lot of the things that we have wouldn't exist, right? Because without trade, we're just getting fewer. If we're producing things on our own, we're getting fewer of some resources or some goods. We just don't have as many resources, right? You rely on who can produce these things using the smallest amount of resources. Everyone can be better off. Okay. So we have 10 minutes left. Well, you guys are always going to be a little bit benefiting from the fact that's the second time that I've said things in a day. So I sometimes have an ability to cut some fat, or maybe I just get winded and I get tired out. But that's where I kind of wanted to stop in terms of getting through that terms of trade stuff. We'll pick up next class thinking about like, how do we then combine this? We know that we've got not just 2 countries, we've got multiple countries in the real world. How do we build what we call like an economy-wide, or you can think of it as like a worldwide production possibilities curve? And then we'll talk about the different issues that exist with that, technology advancements. But just before we get out of here, I'm going to set that up just real quick, and then we can get out of here, just so that I think next class we'll have time to really focus on some things that'll be difficult. Okay. So before I let you out of here, I'm just going to preface this. what we're doing next class with when we think about the production possibilities curve for the world, right? What country, any good we're looking at, who do we want to rely on to first start producing that good? Whoever can produce it at the lowest cost. So what's going to be true about the slope? If I can do this at a very low cost, the slope is going to be relatively. So initially, I might rely on country A to start producing this good, right? They can do it at a pretty low cost, flat slope. Now, eventually, they're going to use all of their resources and they can't produce past this point. If I want more of this good, now who am I going to have to rely on? Whoever can do it at the second lowest cost. Now, they still might have a pretty flat production possibilities curve, but what has to be true? Well, if their cost was a little bit higher, it was not the lowest, it was the second lowest, it's going to have to be a slope that's a little bit steeper, right? And then what about if I want to go past this point? Whoever can produce it the third. And eventually, why does this slope start to get really steep? Because if I want to produce more and more of something, eventually I start relying on countries who can produce it at a the slope is steep. That means their cost is really high, right? If I want to produce more and more of something, I have to start relying on people who can produce it at higher and higher costs. So when we think about not just an individual production possibilities curve, but what we call like an economy-wide, and this could apply same thing. Maybe this is like a firm level production possibilities curve, and these are all my workers, right? If I want to produce more and more of something, I have to start relying on less and less efficient workers or less and less efficient countries or countries who are producing it at higher and higher costs. So our economy-wide production possibilities curve will not be this nice straight line. It's going to be bowed out, right? Reflecting that initially, very low cost of producing this good. Over time, I have to rely on people who can produce it at a higher and higher cost. So we'll use this next class. Get you guys out of here a little bit early. Do you have any questions for me? I'll be up here. Other than that, stay warm. I'll see you guys on Thursday. Oh, let me,
The top hat.
give me 1 second.
Okay.
I forgot on this. Yeah.
When I'm doing the top hat homework, and like I go through and I submit the answers like as I'm going,